Introduction to Philosophy, Plato and Platonism, Part 3. Okay, well, the management thanks you if you send out a postcard because you're enjoying your Plato and Platonism videos so much. We're now in part 3. Right? This is a 4-part series, so we're halfway through at the halfway points. And this part is called Being Reasonable, and I titled it that because we're going to actually learn another form of reasoning, and then we're going to apply it into Platonism. Okay, but before we get there, I want to go back to a slide that was right at the beginning of part 1, where I kind of gave us our learning goals, and we've been working through this in order, right? So we've talked about metaphysics, appearance versus reality, and last video we went through the theory of forms. We talked about dialectical method, right? So we've covered 1, 2, and 3 so far. You should hopefully have written down this list when that showed up right at the beginning of video 1, and sort of checked it off as you gained familiarity with all these different items. In this video, we're going to do number 4, 5, and 6. Right? We're going to do reasoning by analogy, the analogy of the sun, and the image of the divided line. And that will leave us in video 4 with the allegory of the cave. Just one item left for that last video. Okay, so let's get going. Let's get right to number 4, reasoning by analogy. Okay, so we've already learned 2 other ways of reasoning, right? We learned that you can reason using deduction, deductive inferences, and we said deduction is how a rationalist will reason. They'll start with a definition or a principle, a law, and then deduce other pieces of knowledge from those first principles. And we've already said Plato is a rationalist, so he's gonna use deduction, but he doesn't just use deduction by itself. He starts actually with another way of reasoning we're going to learn right now called reasoning by analogy. The other way of reasoning that we learned was reasoning by induction, and we said that's how an empiricist begins to know the world, and that involves not starting with the whole, but starting with the parts, going out and observing the world, collecting a whole mass of data, and then looking at your data, trying to find patterns, and making generalizations based off of those patterns. Okay, what is reasoning by analogy? Well, basically, it says if we have 2 things that appear to be related in a relevant way, right? They appear alike, then we can reasonably infer that something that is an aspect of one of those things is likely to also be an aspect of the other thing. Right? So there's 2 things, they seem to resemble each other. If something is true of one, then reasoning by analogy, since the other thing is analogous, it probably also has that characteristic. And this is not a perfect way, right? We can sometimes get this wrong. 2 things could look alike and then be very different. So we could get fooled here. It's not a perfect way of reasoning, but it's a pretty good way of reasoning often to understand things and to try to learn something about something else when we know something already. Okay, so we have this reasoning by analogy. How is Plato going to make use of this type of reasoning? Well, let's see. Seeing, Plato is going to find, is a lot like thinking, right? In seeing, we grasp an image, right? William James called that a percept, right? And some sort of visual grasping of an image, or any of our senses is going to grab on to some sort of sensory experience, collect together as some sort of image. In thinking, right? Now thinking is different than seeing, but he's saying thinking is kind of like that because we also grasp things, right? We grasp ideas or forms, or as William James said, the concept when we're thinking. So we don't see things in our mind, we think things. But thinking things is a lot like seeing something. It's both a grasping, right? I see images, I think ideas. These images and ideas seem to exist in two different worlds, right? We have the world of ideas then, and the world of visible things. So we're setting up two worlds that seem to be analogous, similar, different. Definitely they're not the same, but they both seem to operate in a similar way, this grasping. All right, where does he go from there? Well, now he's going to reason by analogy. He's going to try to figure something out that he doesn't know actually about the intelligible world, but he knows about the visible world, and he's going to then say, well, we can infer maybe using this reasoning by analogy to say that this is also true of the intelligible world. So in the visible world, there is something called the sun. And without the sun, without this light source, nothing would be visible. So we talked about seeing before. You wouldn't be able to see anything if there was no light source. As well, beyond that, without the sun, nothing would survive or persist, right? Survive through time. Because the sun both makes the planet habitable, right? It heats it up enough so that we don't freeze to death. And it also does what? Besides essential heat, it also provides nourishment, right? We wouldn't have plants without the sun and photosynthesis. And plants die without the sun, and if the plants died, we'd completely mess up our food cycle, and life would not exist on this planet. So the sun makes things visible, and it also is going to be a source of life, and it's going to allow life to sustain itself. So by analogy, Plato is going to reason if there's this sun in the visible world, there must be some sort of, not the sun in the sky, but some sort of intelligible sun in the intelligible world. And that intelligible sun creates some sort of intelligible light such that from that light we're able to grasp ideas, we're able to think ideas. And without the light of this intelligible sun, we wouldn't be able to think things. On top of that, this intelligible sun must also be the source and the sustenance for all that exists in the intelligible world. So he's using this reasoning by analogy to make this inference that there's an intelligible sun. Alright, that's a lot. It's a lot to take in. Another sun, two worlds. So we're going to take a very short break, and we'll be right back.
What should you take to relieve an upset stomach? You have got.
Take pleasant tasting, bubbly, bubbly bromo, that's what. Bromo seltzer works best for upset stomach. Relieves stomach acidity fast. Soothes nerves. Have a bromo.
And bubble your trouble away.
Good day.
Alright, bromo seltzer. Many of you probably know about Alka-Seltzer, but may not be as familiar with bromo seltzer, which actually in 1975 was taken off the market due to toxicity. The bromo seltzer, the thing that why it wasn't called Alka-Seltzer, it was called bromo seltzer because it had bromides in it, and bromides were basically tranquilizers, and people quite liked this product and were upset when it was taken off, but it apparently was not healthy. Okay, so let's move forward. We have this intelligible sun and this intelligible world, these two worlds. Now, Plato thought about how the different forms, I have a whole list on that slide there of different words we could use for the form: idea, form, essential traits, the meaning of something, its definition. These are all words that sort of get at what we're talking about. Right? So the different forms of a square or a chair or even a human being, right? What the definition of a human being is, are all recognized as forms because they must fit the definition of what it means to be a form. Now I think this is confusing. What Plato is saying here is that there's all these different forms, ideas of things of the visible world, right? We see human beings, and then that theory of perception, it refers back to the idea of a human being, right? Not any particular, but the idea of human being itself that we have within us. When we see another human being, we're reminded of that. Now, also the same thing with a chair. We're reminded back of the idea of a chair, the chairness. Now, all of these forms that we're reminded of, that we call all of these forms or ideas, the fact that we see them all as that type of a thing means that they all must fit the definition of a form. So there's going to be a form above those forms. The form of forms. The form of definitions. And what Plato's setting up here in Platonism is a hierarchy, right? That we can get to higher levels of abstraction. And the idea is that if we keep going, we're going to get somewhere. So let's recall some observations from the last video. All forms are perfect, eternal, unchanging, original, etc. We made that table. So by analogy, we can begin to see the forms of square, chair, human being as in some way an imperfect copy of a higher level idea or form. And remember, the thing I drew on the paper was an imperfect copy of the idea of a square. So all these ideas of things analogously must be imperfect copies of a higher level form, the form of the idea of eternity, the idea of perfection. So we are using now our reasoning by analogy to say that as we go higher up, these higher order forms, that they become more and more perfect. And Plato argues that if we keep following up this ladder, and this is not an easy thing to do, and for a lot of people it's hard to make sense of this. For most people it's hard to make sense of how we climb this ladder, ideas of ideas of ideas. But Plato argues if we keep doing that, eventually we're going to get to something that everything else is an imperfect copy of, is somehow a partial copy. And this highest level origin, Plato says, must be this intelligible sun. And Plato will use different words, but one of the words he'll use to talk about this ultimate form, idea, concept is the word logos. And so one might say that Plato says the arche, the source of everything, is logos. That makes everything intelligible. And that actually not just makes the intelligible world, but makes it graspable and sustains it. Okay, that's some pretty heavy stuff. So we're going to take another break, and we'll be right back. But before I want to set this up. Actually, this is an interesting. What you're going to watch is an animation. It's a silent animation, and it's considered the first complete animation. It's like the first cartoon. There were before this one. There were some use of animation techniques, but there was no films that were completely animated. This is the first one. It's by a man named Neil Cole. He's French, and he's an artist. He starts off as a satirist. At one point, that he ends up in jail, and eventually he becomes a part of this group of artists that are called the Incoherent Movement. So this is going to be in contrast to Plato, right? Plato's a rationalist. Everything should make sense. We use reason. Reason should guide us. We should try to grasp the truth. And once we can grasp the truth, we will make good decisions. Here is a group of artists that embrace absurdism. And so what you're about to see is completely absurd. It's the exact opposite of Platonism. And so it'll make a nice contrast. It's also, it's cinema. You're in a room, you're looking at a wall, you're looking at images on a wall, things happening on a wall, and that's actually something that's setting us up for the fourth part of this series. So we can keep that in mind too. Okay, so without further ado, here is Phantasmagory from Neil Cole. Okay, so there it is. Very interesting. That was 700 pictures. What we just watched, one after another. And when Emile Cole produced the art, he had no idea what was going to happen next. It just whatever came out, whatever kind of flowed from his mind went onto the page as he was creating this animation, and it was considered a stream of consciousness. And who coins the word stream of consciousness? None other than William James. Back, a decade, maybe a decade earlier in the U.S. So we have a lot of connections here. Okay, so now we're going to look at some vocabulary. And the first thing I want to say is that Plato is a rationalist. Right? And this is an epistemological term. It's about how we know the world. So Plato uses reason to understand the world. He gives priority to concepts, ideas, forms, principles, essence. Right? Those come first. The definitions, the forms, come before the things we encounter in the visible world, the things that we will in the visible world experience through our senses. Right? Okay, so it's about how we know the world through reason and where we start in our understanding of the world. So we know that Plato is a rationalist, and that's part of his epistemology. Now we're going to look at his metaphysics. And as a metaphysics, we can say that Plato is an idealist. Right? That he gives us an idealism. And this is a position about reality, what's real. And for Plato, what's real are ideas. Right? That's kind of, we established that in the last part, but we haven't formed the vocabulary. And so now we can say that's an idealism, and Plato is an idealist. The form is the eidos, that was the ancient Greek word. That's reality. And that means what we encounter in the visible world, right, which William James called the percepts, and which is not internal, not inside our minds, it's external. That world of experience in Platonism, and Plato will say, is both a mixture of real and not real. It's not completely real. He doesn't want to say it's nothing, because if something is nothing, then anytime you start to talk about it, you turn it into something. It's not just nothing. It's this mixture of reality and nothingness, which we could call illusion. Right? Something that seems real but it's not really real. It's an illusion. It lacks something. Permanence, persistence. Okay, so Platonism is an idealism and it's a rationalism. Right, let's move on. So we have this theory of forms, right? It's a theory that what we see with our eyes always refers back to our forms, our concepts, our ideas, the essences, the principles, and these are perfect, they're immutable, right? They're unchanging, they're eternal, they have no beginning, no origin, and have no end. Right? They cannot be destroyed, erased from existence, or cease to be. So to see something is to recognize that it is a copy of the form that is grasped by our mind. All right, so hopefully we're really getting a better sense of Platonism through this theory of forms and understanding the metaphysics, the epistemology. Let's move on. Let's talk about a paradox. This is called Minos Paradox. And it seems to be a paradox that's going to affect both rationalism and empiricism. So it's a paradox of inquiry and learning. And so let's start with the rationalistic side. Right? So if we know what we are seeking, and in a way Plato is saying that these forms all already exist in our mind and can be grasped in the light of the intelligible sun, then why would we need to seek anything out? Right? Why would we need to learn anything or to inquire? Doesn't seem to make sense if we already know it. If we already can grasp all these forms and ideas, it doesn't seem like there's any need at all for learning or inquiry. Inquiry and learning don't make sense anymore. On the other hand, if we don't know what we're seeking, right? If we don't have these definitions, ideas, principles, essences already within us, and this is the empiricist side, then if we start by going out and just experiencing the world, how will we ever know what it is we're looking at? Or if we're trying to learn something, how would we ever know that that's actually what we're trying to learn? Because we have nothing to compare it to set off the light bulb. Oh yeah, this is it. So it seems in Minos Paradox that learning, inquiry, does not make sense whether you're a rationalist or an empiricist. Here's Plato's solution. He thinks the theory of forms solves this problem, but he has to add on to it. And what he adds on to it is that we are forgetful. And that though we do know all there is to know, we can grasp it. That's the amazing thing about the mind. You can grasp any idea. We have forgotten all those ideas. And so life is about trying to remember these ideas within us. And that when we go and we inquire, we keep going until there's a recognition, until we remember that form that's already within us. So learning becomes recollection, remembering. So he's added into the theory of forms that we have forgotten all those forms. Okay, so solving Minos Paradox. Does it work? Does it not work? I leave that up to you. Plato thinks he solved it. Okay. Continue reviewing. So we talked about the dialectical method, and we're going to talk about that again soon, but remember that was a way to find the truth by forming and testing definitions of things in conversation, right? Throwing something out there and having another person there to help test it. Right? If you're all by yourself, things appear right to you. Right? If you're just by yourself, then the world appears as it does, and it seems to be true to you. It's only when you have somebody else there to challenge you, right? Dialectical conversation, someone else is there to challenge you to make sure, is it really that way, or does it just appear that way to you, that we can begin to really test things. Okay, so we have the dialectical method, and now this video we've talked about the sun, and in our reasoning by analogy, we said the world of ideas, the intelligible realm, the intelligible world, must have something equivalent to the visible sun, and we can call that logos. We could also call it the good. Right? We talked before about how there's this moral element to something that follows the rules. And we can also talk about it as that which is beyond being. And this is a really hard thing to think about, that which is beyond being. That we can talk about something and then say that it's not a thing. But if the intelligible sun is the source of all things, the idea is that it itself can't originally be a thing then. Because if it was, then there would have to be something prior to it that becomes the source of all things. Okay, where am I headed? Well, I want to say that from Platonism, we get an entire religion, Gnosticism. And in this religion, the intelligible Son is taken to be God. And that practicing philosophy is a religious practice where one tries to get closer to God by entering into the intelligible realm and then trying to climb as close as possible up that ladder. Now, the thing about the sun is that the visible sun is that you can't look directly at it. It will burn your eyes and turn you blind. And so by analogy, we can't directly grasp God. It will overwhelm us. It will just burn out our mind. So what can we do? Well, we have to try to get as close as we possibly can. So for a long time, this is, I wouldn't say a major religion, but it's a pretty serious religion. But it requires a lot of philosophizing, right? And a lot of mind work. It's not easy. Okay. We're going to take another break. And this will be the last break in the video. After this break, we have one thing left on that list. We have to talk about the image of the divided line. But before we do that, we're going to watch another animation. This one is from 1916, and it's a Crazy Cat cartoon. Crazy Cat and Ignatz the Mouse at the Circus. And this is created by an artist named George Harriman, and a very interesting person. And a lot of his life story is actually hidden into his work. One of the things, he didn't grow up in New York, but he came to New York just your age, right? In his 20s. He shows up in New York and he's got to find a way to live. He ends up living in Coney Island, and he becomes a sign painter. He's an artist. He's able to make pretty decent signs. And he also becomes a barker, a person who tries to get people to come in and see the shows, the wild and crazy shows down at Coney Island. And that's going to actually, you're going to see in this that it's at the circus, and it's going to kind of look like Coney Island. Another interesting piece of information about George Harriman is that he was originally from New Orleans, and he was mixed race, and so this is 1916. He's made this, and there's a lot of racism, and he's mixed race, but he often, people don't realize that. They consider him to be white. He gets his nickname the Greek at some point, but he doesn't completely hide the fact that he's Creole, but he also takes advantage of people's misseeing his heritage, because he doesn't want to deal with a lot of the racism that's out there. But when you look at the Crazy Cat cartoons, Crazy Cat is a black cat, and Ignatz the Mouse is a white mouse. And there's this whole love story. In later pieces, it's a love triangle that creates a lot of drama, and between a black cat and a white mouse, which plays into his background, right? This mixing. Okay, so that's another thing to look at in the story. This particular piece, in a lot of the Crazy Cat works were not as popular as, for instance, the other animation that we saw in the last video, when we saw Felix the Cat. Felix the Cat was a huge hit. Crazy Cat became really important to a lot of artists, but didn't become super popular. But William Randolph Hearst, who owned a newspaper, fell in love with Crazy Cat and with the work of George Harriman, and made sure that he always had work his whole life. So he produced work until his death. Okay, so let's see it. This is Crazy Cat and Ignatz the Mouse at the Circus. Okay, what an incredible piece of work. What I love about that piece is how Crazy Cat sexism comes back and hits him right in the face. And that was 1916. 3 years later, the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, passes, and then in 1920 it becomes ratified. Okay, so let us move on and now talk about the divided line. So probably they grabbed a stick and they actually drew this picture on the ground. So we drew a line on the ground. In the Republic, it's Socrates who's drawing a line in the sand. And he wants to illustrate something. He's trying to say, this is what I'm talking about is like. And so he draws this line. And what is he talking about? He's talking about study of knowledge and opinion, epistemology and metaphysics, what is real and what is not real. And he divides the line into two parts. And he says one part is the visible world and one part is the intelligible world. And he also says that they are not equally divided. So one side is going to be longer than the other, but it doesn't tell us which side is longer. And this is a real problem. It means we have to try to think about that and what it means for one side to be larger than the other. Does that mean there's just more stuff there? Or does it mean that it's more important? You have to figure out what size the length of that line signifies, and then that will help us to decide which part is the larger side and which part is the smaller side. Regardless, the two sides have a relationship, right? An original copy relationship, where the intelligible world is the original and the copy is in the visible world. Okay, he's not done dividing things up. So now he looks at the side that is the visible world and he draws another line. So that side he's going to also divide. And he says it also, again, this division is not going to divide it equally. It's going to be, one side's going to be larger than the other, and he doesn't tell us which one is larger. But he does tell us what's being divided here. And on the lowest part of the line are what he calls images, reflections, and shadows. So all of those are part of this lower part of the line. And then going towards the middle, we have things. Right? The things that cause those images or cast shadows or reflect on surfaces. Right? So we have the thing and then the images of that thing, or the reflection of that thing, or the shadow of that thing. And he says this relationship holds in this division also, where we have something like an original and then a copy. Right? So a shadow of something retains the shape of the original, right? It's not an exact copy, but it resembles. It's a relationship of resembling. Okay. And he's going to go back to the intelligible side. It's also going to divide that part of the line. And he says it's not equal, but he doesn't tell us which is the larger part. But it does tell us what each of the sides are. So, if we go one step up on this line, excuse me, sorry about that. Oh man, I feel like another one's about to come. My body is getting in the way of my thoughts. Okay. So, I have suppressed my sneeze. Okay, so on the intelligible side, he's dividing it up, and what are the two parts then? Well, on the part closest to the center, we have all the forms, the ideas, or the concepts of the things that we find in the visible world. So we have the definition of a chair, the idea of a human being, the form of a square. All those exist at that first level. All right. What's then at the upper level from there? Well, he says, the higher level, the second part, we have the essence of those lower level forms. ideas, concepts. So before we were talking about that ladder, that hierarchy. He says the higher order forms, which are no longer the definitions of things in the visible world. Right? It's now something, it's a definition of something that only exists in the intelligible world. And that's going to be a more abstract, also more universal sort of thing. And so that's going to be the upper level of the line. So we continue on, and we're going to look at this question. What might be an example of this second half of the line in the intelligible world? It's higher order. Well, Plato says that each idea, form, concept, right, so all of the first order, the lower order, they're all beautiful, right? Because they're beauty because they have this sort of perfection to them. And they're also just, right? Because they're just right. And they're also good. They follow all the rules. So Plato can go one step farther. And he says the higher order, right? When we go above that dividing line, we talk about beauty, justice, and the good. Because we're not just talking about an idea of beauty and justice for the good, but that it's actually beauty itself. Beauty when it's completely detached from all these beautiful things we see. We're just talking about beauty itself. So that the higher order is not just an image of something, it's the thing itself. Again, this is not easy, and I'm trying to just introduce you to so you're more familiar with what Platonism is about. And when he says he's trying to get to reality, he's trying to get to the thing itself. And so he's trying to get beyond just pointing out beautiful things to beauty itself. And this will become a higher order form, the other side. And that all the different lower order forms somehow copy, participate, share, try to be a shadow of beauty itself. Okay. So let's go back to big picture, to that first division between the visible world and the intelligible world. In that first section, now we're talking epistemologically, we form opinions. Because opinions change, and are about things that change. And in the visible world, everything is coming and going. So there's no opinion that's ever going to stand for eternity, because that's a realm of change. But in this other half, the second half, the intelligible world, we have knowledge. Because knowledge here is about things that do not change. And for something to be knowledge, for Platonism, it needs to be fixed, certain, and eternal. So the dividing line gives us an image both of what exists in the world and what kind of partially exists. And it also is showing us it's an image of epistemologically where opinion ends and knowledge begins. Okay, this I find fascinating and it just blows me away. So let's go back to the visible world. And so in the visible world, what we experience is the lowest order. We experience through our senses all the images and the shadows and the reflections. You don't actually see the thing itself ever. And this was something that Kant really talks about as a part of his Copernican revolution. And yet, here's Plato, thousands of years earlier, and basically giving us very similar line of reasoning and observations. So that in this world of opinion, it's through faith that there's actually a thing there. Because all we have are the images of it. Right? Everything is mediated through those images. We never directly get to the thing itself. We just have our sensory experiences within us in the end of that thing. So this is the visible world. This is where we do science. This is the world where we have empiricism. And Plato has flipped things around. And this becomes the world of opinion and faith. Okay. What about the other side of the divided line? The upper half, the intelligible world. So the forms of imperfect things, these are the lower level forms, are encountered using our understanding. We have to come up with the definition. And Plato argues that we use reason in this half, and that in the first half, so instead of our senses, we're using reason. And in the first half, right, the lower level forms, we reason by hypothesis. Now, does that not sound like the scientific method? And here is Plato placing that in the intelligible realm. And what he means by hypothesis is that we propose different definitions that appear to fit with the visible world. And then we test our hypotheses. And this goes back to what we were doing before. Proposing a definition and then testing it, seeing if it works. Testing it out, experimenting. And then if it fails, going back and proposing a new definition. Right? A new hypothesis about what something truly is, what its definition is. Okay, so again, it seems like this incredible, mind-blowing revolution here, where now we have the scientific method taking place in the intelligible world, where we reason, and faith happening in the visible world, the world of the empiricist. Okay, so Plato then gets into some really murky territory. Murky because it's just hard to really understand. But he says in the higher order forms, the other side of that line within the intelligible world, we no longer use hypothesis. He says we use the dialectical method just all by itself. Pure intellectual reasoning. And he wants to make this distinction because he says we no longer are trying to fit our definition with these images we have in the visible world. So we're just pure thoughts by themselves and using reason alone. Okay, so we now have the full divided line. Actually, there's one more thing. It's just off that line. It's right above it. It's above the line itself, above the intelligible world, the intelligible sun. Right? Because that has to be the source of the entire line, including the visible world. So the intelligible world has to also be the source of the visible world, because for Platonism, the idea comes first. So the intelligible sun must come before the visible sun. We have here a picture of the sun from NASA, and they've had to change it a lot because, right, you can't look directly at the sun. You're not going to see it ever directly, and so he's not going to draw on the line the intelligible sun, but we know it's right above it. It's what is allowing us to see and understand that line and to make sense of it. All right, we have finished part 3. Plato and Platonism is not easy. I think the last part is a lot of fun. We're going to hear a story, this allegory, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. And that will finish up our introduction to Plato and Platonism. So I'll see you there.